Please welcome Paul Vigna, The Wall Street Journal, Balaji Srinivasan, 21, and David Rudder, R3.
No, you guys are here. Yeah. Okay. Before we get this started, I just want you guys to know that everybody for days has been telling me how much I have to stir you guys up. So if I ask some hard questions, don't take it personal. And the next time I call you for comment, don't put me through to voicemail.
Sure.
Okay, good. So listen, we have 25 minutes. We don't want to waste a lot of time. So here's the first question. Which of you is building the Betamax?
I think actually both Bitcoin and private blockchain have sort of their own destinies that are sort of complementary and independent of each other. So I wouldn't call them replacement technologies for each other at this point. I think last year I was much more bearish on private blockchain, but as I was talking to David about earlier, I think that Richard Gendel Brown of R3 actually articulated a pretty good case for private blockchain and took it from something that I thought was pretty vague last year into something which is pretty interesting now, right? Like permission ledger, okay, it does make sense in the context that he's applying it.
You agree with that?
I thought we were supposed to start out with a fight.
Throw down, yeah, exactly.
So from our perspective, we're 100% focused on delivering solutions for our membership, and our membership comprises of large global financial institutions. So, from the start, R3 has had a pretty specific focus, and we've worked with a group of the largest banks to really think deeply about what they need for their business. And one of the key components coming into it and my deal with the banks is that we do believe these technologies can be very disruptive, but within the legal and regulatory confines of what exists in global finance today. So maybe we're looking at it more incrementally and not quite as creatively, but certainly we're excited about what blockchain shared ledgers and distributed ledgers are going to mean for our future.
Yeah. Do you think, look, you have a lot of big banks that are working with you, right? You've gotten a lot of excitement, you have a lot of people on board. You are going to have a lot of technical hurdles to get through, legal, regulatory, you just mentioned those things. By the time you eventually build something that could be commercialized, will it be so denuded, will it be so worn down to the hub that a private blockchain, what you want to build, is actually not much of a technical achievement? It's not much of an improvement over what the banks have already.
I hope not. That would be a pretty dire view. One of the things when Balaji and I were talking earlier is I mentioned that we have all these big global banks, so we have custodian banks, and we have payment banks, and we have clearing and settlement banks. So we're not, we have said from the start we're not looking to protect anybody's business. But we are thinking about trying to create a future where innovation at the app level, can be done more efficiently, so that all the smart guys out where you live can actually build applications that can be rolled out. And what you need for that is you need a platform that meets the requirements of global finance, and that includes regulatory requirements. We think a lot about the legal side of it and legal underpinnings and the like. And a lot of our resources spent talking to regulators and really trying to understand what the banks need. But I think that I think Corda, which we announced 2 weeks ago, is a very interesting piece of technology, and it's very promising. And we don't think Corda is going to be the only solution, but we think it's an important step in global finance for our banks.
Yeah, and I might offer something complimentary, which is I actually think that almost no matter what, this is going to be a success for R3 in the sense that at a minimum, it's an excuse for banks to actually go and have a mandate to go and use modern technology on 40-year-old infrastructure. So even if the only thing they did was have first-class programmers go and set up JSON APIs for everything and take all this cruft that's like 30 or 40 years old, even if blockchain is an excuse for doing that, that's an enormous productivity improvement where you're going and plumbing the very bowels of the organization and actually fixing it. So I would say that you're going to see substantial improvements. Now, it might result in maybe a lot of Wall Street jobs lost, but that's a whole different matter.
Right, and I guess that's part of it too. I mean, if ultimately what you're doing, David, results in the bank saving some money, but not really passing along any benefits and throwing a lot of people out of work. Is that really meeting the technology? Is that meeting the promise of this technology, which is something that I know you are interested in also? I mean, what are you doing? What are you doing for society, David Rudder at R3, if ultimately all you're doing is saving a little bit of money for the banks?
Thank you. I have a charitable trust, for example, but that's on the personal front. I think that as far as we look at this, let's face it, the bank model is very challenged at the moment. Not only do we live in this low interest rate environment that impacts their carry, but they've got incredible cost constraints. We've got Basel III capital requirements being rolled out in the banks. So listen, for us, it was this confluence of things that created an opportunity for R3. So it was this beautiful inspiration caused by Bitcoin itself. It was the advancement of artificial intelligence, cloud computing, the fact that big banks began to think about what the possibilities were of how a transaction was processed if they could push their data to the cloud. And so I think the background is there for us to make really fundamental change. And I think, I mentioned, I just witnessed a little bit of what Larry Summers said earlier, and I think he's right. I think the sector shrinks, it becomes more efficient, but those efficiencies are passed on to the consumer. So that's the end game, and if they aren't, the banks are going to be replaced over time, and that's the reality of the situation. So I think it's quite positive outlook, and this technology is creating a lot of opportunity.
Balaji, a question for you. This is a blockchain conference.
Sure.
You just introduced a Bitcoin product.
Sure.
How much time do you have before Bitcoin is ground into the dust and something replaces it?
I think a lot of time. So I don't think that Bitcoin is going to get replaced. I think actually Adam Ludwin had a good thesis, which I'll kind of repeat, which is basically that, and I agree with it, with maybe some modifications. There might be like basically 5 coins that have, or 5 things that have some traction in the years coming forward. Sort of like there's multiple protocols on the internet. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, Zcash, which is sort of up and coming. That's basically the most anonymous coin, right? I think private blockchain for enterprises, and then eventually in the slowest moving will be some kind of private blockchain for governments, maybe on like the 10 or 20 year time frame. And I think that kind of 5-factor typology there will probably capture it, at least from what we can see today. There's always going to be surprises in technology. But I think like Bitcoin is just one of those things that's been written off and left for dead so many times. It's very hard to say that. Like from at least my vantage point, I think it's got some staying power.
Yeah. I mean, you look at this whole sector, this whole industry, this community is changing so fast and it is pivoting so many times. Both of you are trying to build products that you want to have a long shelf life, but the industry seems to pivot every 18 months or so. How do you keep up with that? I mean, you announced a piece of hardware, then you announced a computer, now you're announcing software. How do you guys anticipate what the next pivot is going to be, what the next change is going to be? How do you stay ahead of that? Do you worry about that?
I mean, like internet time is supposedly coined in like the 90s, and that's supposed to be like every 6 months is 18 months and so on. And government time is supposed to be 3x the other way or what have you, right? So to some extent in technology, you're sort of used to that. I would also say it's not like, it's not a matter of pivoting or what have you. It's just simply a matter of, there's the next step in your business model, right? Like Facebook getting onto mobile when it was first a desktop app, technology changes and you need to keep up with it. And no matter what scale of business you are, you need to do that. And the large banks, I give a lot of credit to them actually for running with this and trying to do something that makes sense in their context. Like some people said, R3 is pivoting because they're doing a blockchain without blocks. But that doesn't matter. What matters is the problem domain. And especially early in a space, it's not good to have fixed axioms and to grind along. You have to be flexible and supple and be able to go where the market is going.
So it's interesting. I didn't know R3 was pivoting. I think we constantly I think we're constantly evolving, and we're trying to be very scientific and careful. As far as the time factor is concerned, let's face it, things move a little slower in global finance, but they move slower for a reason. You know, if you're buying a security and you're transferring cash and you're sending grandma money, you want to make sure it actually shows up. So these systems are very antiquated. We all know it. I ran an exchange, the largest global FX exchange, called EBS, and components of that were built on 17-year technology. But guess what? It did hundreds of billions a day without fail, time and time again. So, you know, one of the problems that we face on Wall Street, which Bitcoin has brought so much attention to, that they're talking about it at the C-suite now, and that's what you need, is that the risk reward on change on things like payment systems and clearing and settlement systems isn't great. So if you're the guy that's making that decision on the technology, and so now we're talking about such a tectonic shift from how we've done business in the past to how we've done business in the future. These decisions are going to be made at the C-suite and at the board level, which is going to drive the change, because the guy that runs the payment system isn't going to stick his neck out and take some risk on new technologies. And the other thing I will say is that, having started a lot of trading systems and a lot of businesses in my life, I've never come across anything that needs an ecosystem from the start. So doing these using blockchain technologies in isolation or even in a corner of the market doesn't get near the efficiencies of a big move and a quick level of acceptance, which is one of the things we're really excited about, having all of these. We have 46 banks now that are involved with us, and we're moving beyond the bank sector because we want to be inclusive and collaborative and build that ecosystem. So like I said earlier, you know, applications that drive change can be developed more quickly and more cheaply.
So you unveiled Corda a couple of weeks ago. How much time do you have to produce a commercially viable product? Do you think about that? I mean, what I would like you to do is tell us your deepest, darkest fears. I don't know if you're going to do that, but honestly, like, do you guys think, well, we have a year to come up with a product, we have 2 years, we have 6 months. Do you think about time frames?
Of course. I've been very clear from the start that we're commercially driven. We're a fintech innovation company, and we want to make licensing fees. I don't want to hold roundtables and just do research for our members. But I'm experienced at rolling out new trading systems and new operating systems, post-trade systems, and they always take a little bit longer. One of the things is the banks aren't, our members are customers, and they're not easy to please, so we feel pressure to constantly be doing something pretty big. We had our Project Genesis announcement where we had 40 banks on 5 different blockchain technologies on 3 cloud providers, issue, trade, and redeem commercial paper. That was a pretty big deal. I go to the next monthly meeting with the banks. They're like, "What have you done for us lately?" And then we have the quarter announcement. So the other thing is that R3 is not going to solve the world's problems. I hope that R3 makes it easier for the folks in this audience and the folks in the community to solve the world's problems.
Balaji, so I don't know if you saw, there was an interesting article this week, not related to Bitcoin. Andrew Sullivan in New York Magazine talking about the election. And he came up with this line talking about how what kills democracies is too much democracy. Basically, it becomes just overwhelming. It becomes an overwhelming governance issue when everybody has a voice.
Basically, the whole Trump thing.
Right, the whole Trump thing.
Sure.
Yeah. And we're not here to talk about Donald Trump. That's the next panel. That's for the after party.
Sure.
Bitcoin has a governance problem right now, and you have tied your future to Bitcoin. Bitcoin got to a certain point, got a lot of attention. It has grown. That trajectory has leveled off. You now have this governance problem. You have a lot of developers spending time talking about one little tiny issue when the rest of the world is moving on. You have tied your company's future to Bitcoin. Do you worry that Bitcoin does not have a real future?
So yeah, I'd say 2 things about that. So first is, if you look at how we structure the code, we actually can accept any token for payment required. So it's actually an orthogonal kind of thing where we can swap out one variable and we can accept Ethereum or we can accept Zcash or what have you. So we're future-proof in that sense, right? So in a worst-case scenario, we have an ejector cable if that happens. And one would be remiss to not have something like that. With that said, I think that if you're familiar with this concept like the Gartner hype cycle, right? Everybody has, or every technology has this thing where it's got a technology trigger, it goes up, everybody's super excited about it, it crashes, oh my God, this is so stupid, blah, blah, blah. And then it recovers, and what happens is actually all the profits are made there, right? And that's the same of the dot-com bubble. I mean, Amazon, for example, recently just released record earnings. It's this multi-$100 billion company, global Goliath, et cetera. But to listen to people in 2000 or 2001 or 2002 when their stock price was, in the toilet, this internet thing was just a fad and Amazon will never make money and so on and so forth. And so, everyone can be, Ben Hartz has this good saying, but like everyone can be a leader in the good times, but it is the ability to get through the trial of the Gartner hype cycle and come out the other end that I think is where you really have, exceptional companies. And so that's kind of, what I think.
Yeah. How much time do you have to wait out that cycle?
A lot of time.
You do?
Yeah.
You have a lot of money.
Got time. Yeah.
Time is money.
Sure.
I was interested, I don't know if you guys want to do this, but I'll throw it out to you if you want to. I would be very interested to hear both of you talk about the deficits of, David, say, the deficits of a public blockchain, and for Balaji, actually for you, I want you both to make the other case for the other one, is what I want you to do. What are the problems with private blockchains?
The problems, I thought you want me to make the case for him.
I'm sorry, no, I want you to make the case against him.
Against him, okay.
Yeah,
sure.
Sorry, I misspoke. I want you to make the case against him. I want you to make the case against him.
Well, okay. What are the problems with private blockchains? So I'd say one of the issues is that once you get outside of a certain trust network, then trust necessarily breaks down. So a good example is for, take the Alibaba, recent Alibaba public offering, right? That's something where you have two incompatible, or mostly incompatible banking systems, the Chinese system and the American system, right? And there is genuine, despite the fact that they're trusted within each circle, within each nation state, there's genuine distrust between them in the sense that, people in the US don't, use the same accounting and so on as the Chinese and vice versa. And there's this huge fragile variable rate interest entity thing that was set up in the Cayman Islands for an offering on the New York stock markets. Is this bizarre sort of thing, right? And so that kind of situation is something where you can only expand a private blockchain so much until you start getting into banks that are in Russia or in China or in Iran or in some region that is not really fully a trusted party, right? And in that case, you need some mechanism to generate trust in the absence of social trust, and that is technical trust, right? And that's something where if you can't do social diligence, you do technical diligence, and that's where a public blockchain could actually be quite handy. So I think there's some limits into how big a private blockchain can get because of that.
So from my perspective, I see there's, first off, if it wasn't for Bitcoin, this whole hype cycle and all this discovery around other methodologies and blockchains and private and permission and proof of work and proof of stake and all wouldn't have evolved. So it's been an incredible innovation no matter how you look at it. I think that, from what we're trying to solve for, and with the institutions we're trying to solve it for, which is global financial institutions, not just banks, but we had to start somewhere, there's this embedded trust. And as I mentioned earlier, it's embedded in the legal documentation, it's embedded in the processes, it's embedded in the regulatory side. So for us, the idea of the trustless solution is not necessary. Do I see applications for Bitcoin? Of course. I think Balaji spoke to some earlier. I think there's, for micro payments and, if I was in a hyperinflation emerging country and I could find someone that had Bitcoin that was crazy enough to make me a price, I would buy Bitcoin. For me and where I sit in America, although I do own Bitcoin and I own it in case I'm ever asked if I do, to be honest, but I couldn't actually, I'd have to turn to somebody and say, where do I find my private key? But for me to use Bitcoin doesn't make any sense. And one of the things, so I'm a markets guy. I've been looking at price for a long time, and I'll ask Balaji, because one of the things I don't understand is through the seniorage, there's this constant supply of Bitcoin. And what I haven't seen was when I go to my local mall or my local stores, I haven't seen a sign that says Bitcoin accepted. So even though I don't watch this closely, I don't see increased demand on that. So I'm interested. The price has appeared relatively stable to me lately, even though I don't watch it closely. So I'm kind of interested in what's the demand drive for Bitcoin? I'd love your perspective on it.
Absolutely. So let me ask you guys a question. So do either of you use Linux?
Not knowingly.
Exactly. So you kind of,
Right.
so when I usually ask that question, people say, no, I don't use Linux. So I say, do you use Google? Do you use Facebook? They say yes. Do you use Android? They say yes. So I say, you use Linux, but you don't know you're using Linux, right? And that's because, if I give a long-winded analogy, Bitcoin, I think at the present time is like Linux in the sense that it solves developer problems, right? If you're an engineer and you want to do small, fast, international, automated micropayments, and you want to build new kinds of programs that are based on that, Bitcoin is your only option. It's good for payments that are very large, very small, very fast, very automated, or very international. And if you're doing things that are many of those things combined, you just can't use the traditional wire system. And so that's like the complete opposite end of the spectrum in some ways from what you guys are dealing with, which is massive amounts of commercial paper being moved between banks. So it's different like niches in the ecosystem. To continue the Linux analogy, I think one thing that is true, and so now I'll actually, okay, this might be the poke that Ryan Selkis wanted to see in this one, okay? So prepare yourself, okay. So one thing that I do think, if you take the Linux versus Windows analogy, right? So Linux in the early 90s, it had, zealots who, and I say that with all due respect because I was one of them, who would write like Microsoft with a dollar symbol, and they were anti-capitalist and, so on, and believed in open source and free software, and they were against this greedy capitalist kind of thing. And they provide a lot of the initial drive for Linux, and for many years their quest was, dethrone Microsoft, take them off, right? Mm-hmm. And what happened was basically Microsoft did not lose the desktop. In fact, it basically just grew that market all the way through the 90s. But where Linux found its niche was actually not on the desktop, but in the cloud, server side, right? Especially with Google and then with Facebook and so on, Linux became, the language of not the language, but the platform of the cloud. And then by about 2005 or thereabouts, it was just de rigueur if you were a developer that you'd do your stuff in Linux and you deploy it there and you develop there. And then what happened, something very interesting happened because the next desktop was built on Linux, Android, right? And so now, if you also include like OS X, which is built on BSD, which is a cousin of Linux, something like 98% or 99% of the next desktops, all the mobile devices out there use Linux, and Microsoft is on the back foot and declining in some ways, though Satya is doing a pretty good job in trying to bring it back up. He's actually embracing Linux. He's got Bash running on Windows now, right? So in kind of the same way, that's sort of how I think about this story with Bitcoin and the banks and so on is going to play out, right? Like a lot of guys who are into Bitcoin early on for ideological reasons, right? Just like the early Linux guys were anti-capitalist, these guys are, anti-Fed, right? And that drives them, that drove them, when it was not economically rational to work on Bitcoin, they worked on Bitcoin for ideological reasons. That's what you need, kind of a collective hallucination to bootstrap something at the beginning. That's what all startups are about. And so then what happened was, it actually became useful, right? Or started to become useful to people. And people talk about Linux, or Bitcoin rather, being used to pay for coffee at stores. But I don't think it's actually going to be useful for that. I don't think it's useful for the physical world. I mean, if Windows had a network effect, the US dollar has an incredible network effect. You can go to Zimbabwe, you can go to India, Nigeria, 200 years of, Hollywood and world wars and shit, like the US dollar is recognized everywhere, right? Yeah. Massive capital investment in making sure that your visual cortex picks that up as that has value, greenback anywhere, right? So you're not going to displace that with Bitcoin. The physical US dollar is not going to be displaced. It's like Windows in that sense. But I think what does happen is Bitcoin first, over the next 5 to 10 years, becomes the currency of the internet, right, for machine payments and things like that. And then over the next 20 years becomes the currency of the next world, which is VR. So that's actually where I think things really happen. Once you start spending more time in VR than you do walking around, and that's also going to happen if you think about how much time you spend looking at a monitor. It's more than 50% of your waking time.
And you raised enough money to wait that out?
I wouldn't wait it out. We'd try to make a profit before.
Try to make a profit before then? Okay.
You can always go back for more, too.
Yeah, sure.
For smart guys, there's a lot of money out there.
David, I know we only have a minute, but we'll go a little bit over.
Yeah.
I just want to ask you one before I let you go.
Sure.
Everybody in the financial world is now on top of this and trying to build a product. You have a lot of competition. How do you view that?
So I don't think we have a lot of competition because we're not venture backed. We don't feel a lot of time pressure, and we're working with very large consumers to build products for them, and most importantly, their customers. We think we're in a very good position. And you had Adam up here earlier. We're close with Adam. We talk regularly with itBit and Ripple and Symbiont and a lot of the players in the market. So I think that we're unique from the perspective that we have a large network of very powerful banks. We have time. We've got a very nice balance between older financial guys like me and some really smart young guys like Richard Gendel Brown and Mike Kern. So I love our position, and we're open for business. We're not a closed network. I hate when I see that R3 is a standards body. I recognize the need for a massive expansion of standards in the world of ledgers, and hopefully we'll accelerate and drive that through our network. But we're certainly not going to be out there replacing ISDA and other mechanisms that are there to do it. So I'm very pleased and very grateful for where we sit. And thank you for having us on the panel.
All right. I want to thank you guys for joining us at UFC 202. It's a UFC joke. It's why you look at one pop reference.
Yeah,
all right, that's it for us.
I'm sorry we didn't stir it up anymore.
Balaji, David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that.